Bonjour, bonjour, mes amis. It is absolutely delightful to be here with you this evening, discussing all things blood pressure, all things hypertension, all things big scary words that we come to fear and we don't want as we get older, and yet sometimes it still creeps up on us. And I have the delightful Dr. Varden who's going to explore this with me this evening. Bonjour, Madele. How are you
Oh,
today?
sure. I'm very well. Always love doing these webinars with you, with our audience.
Yeah.
Just be an honor to be here.
Yeah. And I'm really looking forward to tonight's topic in particular because I think at least when you and I were on the prep call for this, I was shocked at the numbers. I think I forgot how high the numbers are of people struggling with hypertension. And so I'm really glad that we get to dive into the specifics of a condition this evening that, let's talk about this, 1 in 2 Americans has. 1 in 2. Yeah, if you go back to like lecture hall, you were standing in that big auditorium and they'd be like, look to your left, look to your right. At least one of these people, right? If not, it's going to be you,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, and talk to me how those numbers have changed over time because they weren't always that bad, correct?
no, actually, when I was doing some research for this, I was looking at some papers, CDC, WHO, looking at the global hypertension crisis.
Yeah.
And one of the resources I looked at said between the years of 1990 and 2019, so a 30-year span, okay, the number of people between the ages of 30 and 79 years old with hypertension, it doubled in that 30-year time period. And this is even before the pandemic.
Mhm.
So when we are talking about hundreds of millions, I mean, even more than 500 million people, of just men, both men and women, so actually it's even over 1 billion people together, having that's kind of scary.
Yeah. And Mocha's calling out in the comments, they're saying that it's only 1 in 4 Canadians, and I value the Canadian pride. And I want to acknowledge, like, across by different countries, right, these numbers are going to change. But I think, especially specific to the US, there was almost a doubling between the 1990s and current days to the numbers. And I think while Canadians may not have the 1 in 2 and they're at 1 in 4, and other countries are going to be at different places, we're all more or less following that trend, not necessarily of doubling, but creeping up there. And there's a few reasons for it, a few lifestyle reasons, a few medication reasons. There's a lot. And so
Oh yeah.
that's what we're going to be doing this evening with you all. So this evening, welcome. What we first want to do is dive into hypertension. We first kind of want to talk about what it is, how you qualify to have it. We want to talk about why, the reasons behind, the mechanisms behind. It's going to sound like a lot of science, but I promise it'll be quick, it'll be painless. And the purpose of that is to really help set the stage for the genes that we're going to be looking at and that influence that genetic risk. Okay, so for those that have their 360 already, we're going to be looking at 3 different genes this evening. I'm cheating when I say 3. Technically, one is a location on the genome, but we're looking at 3 points of DNA this evening. And so if you have your DNA 360, I'd really encourage you to open it up and you want to go to the cardiovascular section. Okay. And I'd say go right to the summary because we'll be bouncing around a little bit. So in the summary, at least you can kind of see all the genes that we're talking about. All right. So let's first talk about exactly what hypertension is. So Dr. Varden, you go to the doctor, they toss that cuff on, and then they spit 2 numbers at you. What
Right.
exactly are those numbers? And when
Well,
do we become concerned with them?
exactly. And before I get into hypertension, which is generally a diagnosis, let's talk about blood pressure, that cuff, the blood pressure cuff that they throw on you and they say, okay, just, be calm, don't talk, just let it do its thing. So blood pressure, we've all heard it, but what exactly does it mean? And it really, blood pressure is the measurement of force that your heart uses to pump blood through your arteries. That's what it is. It's a vital sign to show how your cardiovascular system is working, because blood pressure ensures that oxygen, nutrients are delivered efficiently to all the body's organs and tissues. And, don't forget, like when we're standing and sitting, we have to go against just, regular, oh goodness heavens.
Gravity. It's
Thank
okay.
you. I love it. We
One
have
of
to
those days.
practice
It's okay. We're gonna get
gravity.
there. The apple will fall on the head. We're gonna be good.
Apparently, I need a little more oxygen and nutrients to my brain. So, we have to have a certain amount of blood pressure to get that blood nutrients up to our brain, but also all the way down to our toes and our fingertips,
Mm.
and that's very important. So, when they're looking at blood pressure, it is measured in millimeters of mercury. So you'll see a mmHg. That's what that stands for. And it's recorded with two numbers. So the two numbers, the top number is called the systolic pressure. That is the pressure in your arteries when your heart contracts and pumps blood. It's the higher of the two numbers. Then that bottom number is called the diastolic pressure. And that measures the pressures in the arteries when your heart is at rest between the beats.
Mhm.
So, for example, a normal blood pressure reading is considered 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay. That means that you have 120 millimeters of mercury of the systolic, 80 of the diastolic. Now let's jump into what hypertension is. Hypertension means high blood pressure. Hyper, above, tension, that pressure, that force. And that occurs when your blood pressure is consistently above the normal range, putting strain on the heart, on the blood vessels, and over time, it can lead to serious health problems, even if you feel fine. This has been termed the silent killer. So when we're talking about diagnostic thresholds of like, okay, well, what are the numbers that dictate hypertension? And these numbers are based on the American Heart Association guidelines. So I've already told you what normal was. That's, the 120 over 80 or a little bit less, there's a little bit of wiggle room there. Elevated is considered a systolic of 120 over 129 with a diastolic less than 80. Stage 1 hypertension is considered systolic of 130 over 139 with a diastolic of 80 to 89. Stage 2 is having that systolic of equal to or greater of 140 over a diastolic of equal to or greater than 90. And then when you are in hypertensive crisis, that is when systolic is over 180 and or diastolic is over 120. This is an emergency. You really need to make sure that you are at the hospital or get to one right away. So
let's,
yes.
I want to next jump into what causes hypertension, especially more in that chronic state, right? Because for our audience's awareness, sometimes your blood pressure is going to go up in response to stress, and that to a certain extent is very healthy. What we're talking about tonight is that consistent reading of high blood pressure. Okay. So I want to jump into the why, but before we do that as well, for awareness, especially for those that are new joining us, we show up to serve you, and so we offer a survey at the beginning of this. We ask people to fill it out so that we know why you're here, how we can support you. So if the powers that be want to toss that survey up. And I want to acknowledge our co-pilot this evening. This is Napita. Her sister's on a diet, so she's not happy with me, so she'll be here for most of it. Apologies if I can't apologize for her. Cat's cat. All right. So we asked the first question of, do you have hypertension? Does a family member? And 45%, about half of our audience has it. Equally, also half of our audience has family members with it. And so we'll be exploring the genes tonight in particular that can lend that higher blood pressure. Next, we asked, are you taking any medication for it? Which is very common, especially once you hit that stage 1. Typically, from a GP's perspective, a prescription is required, even though there are diet and lifestyle interventions. And about 40% of our audience is, and we have a happy 56% that is not. And a really amazing, hats off to you, 3% of the audience used to be on a hypertensive medication, meaning 3% of our audience, and shout out to you, shifted their diet and lifestyle in a way that they no longer needed that. So my praise to you. I'd love to know in the chat what you guys did to shift that, because that's such a beautiful statement of how what you do in your day-to-day life can take away medication and better your health. We asked what's the biggest concern when it comes to high blood pressure, what would motivate you per se to an extent not to have it. Heart disease and stroke risk for most of our audience, very understandably. Um, Not knowing the root cause is a concern, right? Family history, a concern. So all of these sorts of things. And as well, I'm seeing an interesting 30% of the audience is saying side effects of medications, right? You have hypertension, you're tossed on stuff. It's not always going to feel great. Sometimes it's a cough, sometimes it's the urination patterns, but we'll talk through things that you can work on in conjunction with your doctor to see if you can get off some of those medications. Lastly, we asked, have you done any genetic testing? And it looks like 60% of our audience this evening has. So I really encourage the 60% that has, please do have your tests ready so that when we get to the part where we're diving deeply into the genes, you know where you fall. Okay. All right, guys, let's jump into the very important why of this. And I know this is going to feel a little bit like going back to science class, but I promise there's method to madness, because when we talk about how do we support people lowering blood pressure, it's not going to be one thing, and you need to understand the different ways, the different avenues that you can get there, so you know the different avenues you can take to get away from there, right? So I guess, Dr. Varden, do you want to kind of kick us off first and foremost with some of the kidney, the angiotensin, some of the biochemical fun things that can get us there?
Well, absolutely. And actually, this gets into one of the major genes that affects our body that in the fashion of blood pressure and possible hypertension. And that is the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. It's also known as the RAS system, RAAS. And the gene that is related to this is the ACE gene, the angiotensin converting enzyme gene. And I'm going to explain this with a bit of an analogy, because I think that would probably be the easiest way to explain this, because it can get a little, dense medically, and we don't want to, do that. So for this RAS system, I want you to think of it like your body's plumbing control center, okay? And it helps to keep your blood pressure just right. Make sure that you have enough water and salt in your body, because your kidneys and the organs, they're trying to keep this wonderful balance to make sure that you have what you need. So here's how it works. So the first thing, let's talk about low blood pressure or dehydration when that happens. So imagine you're low on water. Like when you're sweating a lot, haven't had too much to drink, or maybe your blood pressure drops and your body notices this. So what ends up happening is that your kidneys are like alert guards, okay? And when they sense the drop, they release a chemical called renin. Now, renin turns on angiotensin 1. It finds that protein in your blood called angiotensinogen, there we go, and changes it into angiotensin 1. But angiotensin 1 doesn't do much yet, okay? This is where ACE, okay, an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, changes it into angiotensin 2. Now, ACE is mostly found in your lungs. And this is what turns that angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Now we're talking, okay? So angiotensin 2, it does two big things. First one, it tightens the blood vessels, kind of like squeezing a garden hose that raises your blood pressure, okay? And it tells your adrenal glands to release aldosterone. Now, aldosterone, this helps to save salt and water. It's a hormone. It tells your kidneys to hold on to salt and water instead of letting it go into your pee and getting rid of it. So keeping the salt and water raises the blood volume and therefore the pressure. Now, why does this matter? Well, because if you're losing too much water or your blood pressure is low, RAS helps to bring it back up. But if the system is too active all the time,
Mhm.
it can actually lead to high blood pressure, which isn't healthy for your heart or your blood vessels.
Mhm.
So, I want you, when you think about this gene, when you think about the system, think of it like that that home sprinkler system that turns on when your blood tank is low, and it
Mhm.
tightens the pipes, okay, the blood vessels, adds more water, blood volume, okay, and holds on to salt, all to raise the blood pressure to keep your body balanced.
Yeah, I love that. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
So what you just said, kind of the mechanisms that monitor what's in the blood and how much blood volume there is through this RAS system is one of the influence points we have with blood pressure. Another point that I want to quickly explore. So we've looked at kidneys and that blood volume. Want to look at the whole cardiovascular system, right? So the system is, we think about it like a heart. The heart's what's pumping everything, and then attached to the heart are a lot of arteries and veins, and that's what pushes all this through. Now, remember that all of that piping, right? It needs to be both flexible as well as strong to deal with the changes of pressure, right? We said originally that some pressure changes in response to stress, in response to activity, all of that is normal, right? So there has to be this flexibility and the strength of the system to not only deal with high blood pressure, but also to accommodate the both. Now, here's the tricky part. If you're asking too much of this system because you're not living a diet and lifestyle that lends to good blood pressure regulation, right? Or separately, and this is where we're going to get into the genes, or you have genes that don't support this flexibility, then your system's going to be a lot more condensed. It's going to be less strong, right? And of consequence to that, you're going to have greater blood pressure because you can't expand in response to high blood pressure. You stay super tight, right? Think about that pop can that you shake up, right? Until you open it, that pressure is just going to keep building. And then once you do, something pops. And that tends to be, people talked about in the chat, or sorry, in the intake quiz, what are they concerned about? Heart disease. That's part of it. You get that really stiff artery or vein, and it's like, cool, I'm out. This is too much pressure. And it pops, just like that pop can or soda can for Americans, because I'm learning American. Yes. Mocha, I feel you. I'm learning American as we go along. All right. um, Dr. Varden, do you want to, and I think this is an important one to really hone in on. This is, I know, one of our collective favorites. Do you want to talk about how the nervous system influences blood pressure?
Well, the nervous system, I mean, you consider that the nerves, they're the neural muscular junctions, they help to affect and respond to the muscles in the body and the vasculature and the because in your vasculature, those are muscles, and we have to have information that flows and responds, and there's these sensors, and it's just this beautiful checks and balances. But when we're talking about like the nervous system, our brain, or when we have things that put us in a sympathetic state, okay, our body responds accordingly. This is our fight and flight. So in this, things tense up. Our blood pressure goes up because it's giving us the energy. It wants to send nutrients and glucose to the muscles, so that way we can run away, or we can fight, or we, can do what is necessary, for our survival, because it is that type of a very basic reaction, when we are in that sympathetic state, as compared to parasympathetic, where it's the rest and digest, the calmer, lower heart rate, lower blood pressure. So
We won't, I think for the audience, we won't get too deeply into, I guess, the genetics of what influence stress or what influence the nervous system, right, at kind of the brain level. But I think it's really, really important to understand that Stress, especially chronic stress, is one of the bigger, if not the biggest outside of diet contributor to hypertension. Okay. And that can be simply, as Dr. Vernon was talking about, tense muscles that then send signals, or it can also be a tense stress mind that then sends signals, right? I think I always find it really interesting. Like my mom kind of grew up in a point where there wasn't this awareness there was connection between mind and body. And so as she got older, and she fully gets this now, but I remember listening to her, she came into that understanding of, oh my gosh, mind and body are connected. And now that we're in this space of science where we can very carefully find those chemical messengers that say, here's a thought, and that's what begets things. So when you hear people talking about meditation and mindfulness and stress reduction in terms of blood pressure, there's quite literally physical actions here. Right. And if you want, there's other webinars that we've done on stress, and I'd really encourage listening to those to look at the genes that curate stress and how you can go about at a genetic level, an informed level, reducing the stress in your world in a way that makes sense to your body. Yeah. Yeah, we won't focus on it too much tonight, but it's super important. And please do check out kind of the genes behind stress, right? Because they really influence hypertension. All right, Dr. Varden.
All
So
right.
we have talked through stress and kind of the nervous system and how it influences. We've talked through the vascular system and how it's set up, how it flexible and strong strength will lend to blood pressure or lack thereof. And then we've also talked through kidneys and the REN system, the ACE systems that will look at how to regulate blood volume, right? So I know we talked about ACE in terms of blood volume. Why don't we talk about some of the other genes that really influence the vasculature, right? Do you have a preference? Where do you want to start? 9p21 or NOS?
Hmm.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, you know what? Let's go with 9p21 first.
I love it. All right. So
Yes.
9 Peter 2 1. And this is where we told you a lie. It's not a gene, it is a location, and it has a lot
Yes.
of impact. So, Dr. Barton, why don't you talk about this impact? Because it's when we're looking at it, we're looking at three different SNPs.
Mhm.
And just to remind people, SNPs are kind of one point within a gene or a location in our case. And they tend to be, think about a book. A gene is a book. There's a lot of pages in a book, right? Not every page is created equal. Not every page has plot points. We're looking at three different pages within the 9p21 region that have really important plot points. Okay, so we're looking at three SNPs. Dr. Varden, what do these SNPs tell us?
Okay, well, first of all, the SNPs are very strongly associated with coronary artery disease and atherosclerosis, which
Mhm.
can narrow blood vessels and increase vascular resistance, that contributing factor to hypertension. When we're talking about resistance, I again want you to think about a water hose. Anytime that you are squeezing that, you are putting resistance on it and it increases the pressure. Okay, so when we're talking about the 9p21, as Dr. Kosterman has said, it has SNPs, but we look at it cumulatively when we report this in your DNA 360 report. So if you're in your cardiovascular profile and you're looking at your summary, the sub-report, okay, you'll see 9p21, and then you'll see a number and the letter G. So your number will be anywhere from 0 to 6. So what does that mean? Well, the numbers mean how many G alleles are found at those SNP locations. So she said there are 3 points, 3 places on the chromosome that we're looking. And then you're probably going, well, then why would there be 6? Well, you have 2 chromosomes. Okay. And they're the way I like to, the analogy I use for
One
my
from mama
client.
and one from papa.
Yes. The analogy I like to use is like, okay, so you have the 2 chromosomes and you can think them like parallel streets. And as we are going down these streets, there are 3 houses on each street. Okay, the 3 SNPs, 3 sections we're looking at. And what I say is that If any of these houses have black shutters, G alleles, it means that those houses can burn down more readily, that the vasculature, the endothelial lining can become inflamed much more readily. Okay. So obviously we don't want a lot of houses with black shutters. We don't want very many, or any at all G alleles. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So drive down and see how many you have. So again, you either have 0 to 6. I personally, and I've made this known before in other webinars, I happen to have 5 G alleles. I have 5 houses with black shutters. So yeah, I'm much more sensitive,
Yeah, and let me toss out.
inflammation. And, it's just one of those things. So when you are looking at individuals like myself with risk variants like that, we can tend to have greater vascular inflammation, endothelial dysfunction, impaired vessel repair, blood vessel repair. That can be a problem. And that will look and can be found as higher blood pressure. Now, know that 9p21 itself does not regulate blood pressure directly, okay? The vascular damage it promotes can lead to secondary increases in blood pressure. So this is something to be aware of, to try to lessen the exposure of toxins, whether it's exogenous outside yourself or whether it's endogenous that we make ourselves, that can cause those microabrasions, the inflammation. And then also, how can we support, that endothelial lining? So, and that's some of the things that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so for those that have the report, just as a reminder on that spectrum of 0 to 6, if you're looking at the 5 or 6 space, right, that's where we have great concern because you don't have that strength and flexibility. You're more prone to inflammation, more prone to cardiovascular. If we were to compare you to someone with 0 G, you're looking at about 1.8 times risk increase. Okay. If you're sitting in that 3 to 4 space, so this is one category down, you're looking at a risk increase of 1.2 to 1.4, depends on the study. So a small, like it's still an increase, but less than 1.8 markedly. Okay. And that means you're prone to some inflammation at this level and more are still at risk for, but less risk for that constriction. And if you are walking amongst the gods and you have 0 to 2, congratulations. While we still do need to be concerned about cardiovascular inflammation, its primary motivation, its primary inspiration is not going to be your genes. Okay. So if you do have, again, you're registering higher on this spectrum, 2 different things. It will contribute to hypertension as you get older, but separate to that, you all the more want to be mindful of your blood pressure right away because you don't want to be stressing this vasculature system in a way that's going to encourage that loss of strength, that loss of flexibility because it's in that inflamed state. Okay, so think about it from 2 different perspectives. If you don't have hypertension, avoid it at all costs, especially if you're sitting at these higher G spectrums, okay? And if you do have it, lowering your blood pressure is really, really important to your larger cardiovascular health and larger cardiovascular picture. All right. Why don't we dive into the next one? Do you want to start talking about NOS?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So the NOS3 gene, and again, you will find this in your summary reports in that cardiovascular section. This encodes endothelial nitric oxide synthase. This is an enzyme responsible for producing nitric oxide, which is very critical as it promotes vasodilation, that like the water hose getting bigger instead of squeezing it tight, and where it will help regulate vascular tone, it maintains the endothelial function, and it helps to lower the blood pressure. Actually, there was some really interesting meta-analyses that I was reading over beforehand, when I was prepping to get some information. And I actually was reading about this meta-analysis that included over 60 studies with 14,000 hypertension cases and 13,000 controls that found that eNOS, okay, endothelial nitric oxide synthase, the polymorphisms, meaning the variants or mutations in that gene, significantly increased hypertension risk under multiple genetic models. I mean, excuse me, the fact that the findings were consistent across different ethnic groups, regions. It really highlighted the universal importance of this genetic variant in blood pressure regulation. Yes.
Yeah. And no, that actually primes me to a really interesting and good point. Thank you for reminding me. I want to quickly talk about ACE. So for our friend ACE, ACE is an interesting one in that if you are of certain populations within China, namely Han Chinese, you present differently than the balance of the world that we are aware of, genetically speaking. So a question I get quite often is, I am First Nations, I am Black, I am Hispanic. Does that impact how my results are interpreted? Or like, are they, is it different, right? And by and large, the answer we have is no, except for right now that we are aware of one specific gene, ACE, that we've talked about. And so if you look at the report, Dr. Varden, hold me honest, ACE, the optimal presentation is GG, correct?
No,
It's
actually,
AA.
yes.
Okay,
GG is
AA.
optimal for Asians,
Thank you. I
for
was
the
I was
Asian,
nervous I was going to mix
but
this up.
in the
Okay.
rest, it's actually an A.
So in the report, we do categorize AA as the optimal presentation. If you are Han Chinese, and I think this has slowly been expanded a little bit larger within the Southeast Asian diaspora as well. So if you have some Indian roots too, okay, then AA is actually the suboptimal presentation for you, and you want a GG presentation. We do specifically call this out in the report, so you don't have to remember this, but I think it's really, really important to kind of call this out. Should you be of one of those diasporas, one of those descents, this gene is kind of flipped on its head relative to the balance of the world, which would be European, African, and American diasporas. Yeah. All right. So I think we've happily gone over the three genes that we want to go over insofar as we've talked about ACE and how that shifts sodium and blood volume. We've talked about 9p21, which speaks to how flexible and inflamed our arteries might become and kind of the risk there. And then we've also talked about NOS, this thing that is popped out when things get too pressurized to relax us, right? Men read in between the lines. This is also really important for some of your functioning, right? And so now why don't we start talking about, if you have suboptimal presentations in any of these categories, because I'm going to imagine most of our audience has at least one suboptimality within the three, what do we do about it, right? That's the important part here. What do we do about it? And I asked the question before of, those that have come off blood pressure medication. Dave answered and he said a large part of his shift was diet, right? He didn't say what diet he switched from, but I would imagine a standard American diet, shift to something more keto, and that markedly dropped the amount of medication that he needed. So I hear diet. So Dr. Varden, why don't we start talking, if you have suboptimal presentations in any one of the three, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts when it comes to diet or lifestyle? Where do you start jumping in to optimize once you know about genes?
Well, I'll tell you, this dovetails so beautifully into something I wanted to mention, and that is really this is perhaps the most intriguing aspect, is that gene diet interaction that is observed with, and I'm going to call out the ACE gene. Okay. So, and when I say the variant or a mutation, I am talking about the general population. So this would be, excuse me, this would be the A as an apple variant. I'm sorry, that being the positive, the G being the suboptimal. Okay. So, so I'm not talking about the Asian, or the Chinese where it's flip-flopped. I'm talking about in general, where A is optimal and G is suboptimal. So research has shown that a high saturated fat diet increases ACE serum concentration. So that's angiotensin converting enzyme, serum in the blood, concentrations in all genotypes, no matter what it is. Okay.
Mm.
But the effect is doubled in GG carriers compared to AA or AG carriers. And this just demonstrates a clear nutrigenetic interaction with profound
Yeah.
implications for personalized dietary recommendations.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It's incredible, I think, once you look at genes, especially from a metabolic perspective, right? If we include
Mhm.
sugar, which is hard to tease out some of this conversation,
Right.
it's incredible how focused you can get on a cardiovascular plan. I find sometimes when people come in and they're like, I've been diagnosed with high blood pressure or high lipids, right? And the doctor's thrown good diet and good lifestyle at me. And I'm grateful the doctors throw that out first now. I think that's
Mhm.
wonderful. That said, I can imagine that feels really, really overwhelming to someone of, you have high blood pressure, change absolutely everything. Some people need to start with a little bit before they can start with everything. And I love that genes, to your point, really can focus us in on what exactly do we want to start with, right? So if you have this ACE gene, looking at a processed food diet, looking at sodium, if what I'm hearing you say is correct, then that's probably one of the first places you want to start, right? Because that will have the most genetic ROI, for lack of better phrasing.
Right.
Yeah.
And, really, I mean, when you consider, conventional medicine, as some of our audience has already mentioned about, you know, typically being treated, or treating their hypertension with medications.
Mm.
Now, granted, yeah, that addresses symptoms rather than the root causes. And while those medications can effectively lower blood pressure numbers, they often come with those unwanted side effects, and they really fail to
Mhm.
address the underlying genetic and environmental factors that are driving that condition. And
Mhm.
as in comparison, when we get into functional medicine, this really, and what we're looking at, it really offers a much more comprehensive approach to identifying and addressing the root causes of the hypertension, including those genetic predispositions. And it really can help, rather than, just trying to deal with the symptom, really looking at it in this multiple interconnected systems, rather than the isolated issue of blood pressure alone. So,
Yeah.
excuse me, it definitely something to look at. It's more than just getting your blood pressure, but also looking
Mhm.
at knowing what your genes are, getting some blood panels to assess what is your metabolic health, how is your insulin, resistance, your nutrient status, because excuse me, I think that knowing these things, including knowing testing for heavy metals, environmental toxins, things that can cause inflammation of your endothelial lining, that can really help to
Yeah.
start zoning in on where to start first to get the most ROI.
Yeah.
Food
Yeah.
is definitely a quick and easy,
Mhm.
way to do that, cutting
Yeah.
back on saturated fats, making sure that the food that you're eating is more organic, doesn't have as much
Mhm.
toxins in it, because again, that's going to then affect endothelial lining, blood pressure, and, a whole series of things that can cause an
Yeah.
increased blood pressure.
And for the plant nerds out there, I like that we're having this conversation of what to take out, but I also want to consider what to toss in. So for the plant nerds out there, hibiscus, or I believe it's hibiscus within kind of South America, and then the Caribbean, I think it's called sorrel. This is a beautiful, beautiful flower, and if you create tea out of it, not the fermented tea, but tea out of this, and you're consuming several cups a day, it can lower blood pressure by 15 to 20 points, depending on where you start. There's a bit of a range, right? You start at the higher end, you're going to see more of a dramatic difference, but that can happen within the course of just 3 or 4 weeks. And so you really do need to talk to your doctor, make sure you're monitoring how low you're going, right? But there's a lot of different plants that you can bring in that act as natural ACE modulators, suppressors, depending on the plant. And I think that's really important, that as you think through what are you taking out, also think through what are you adding in. right? Magnesium has a lot of evidence behind it, right? Olive leaf, garlic, there's a few things a lot of people have heard about, but this is kind of where adding in plants can be incredibly beneficial because they have naturally occurring compounds that are documented to lower blood pressure by mostly shifting ACE. There's a few other ones different plants will tap into, but they've been studied mostly in regards to ACE. Um, yeah,
And something I wanted to bring up,
yeah.
when it comes to diet, excuse me, the DASH diet, if anybody has
Mm,
ever heard of this, that stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. And that approach has been shown to reduce systolic blood pressure by 11 millimeters of mercury and diastolic by 4.5 millimeters of mercury compared to some medications, but without side effects, just
mm,
by shifting that diet, which, one of our audience so greatly, and mentioned
they-
in the chat.
Mhm,
So you were getting into, different types of things in magnesium, because magnesium is wonderful. Magnesium is necessary
mhm,
to attach to ATP in order to release that muscle contraction. That's one of the major
mhm.
things that magnesium does, along with the other 300 plus, reactions that it's a part of. But when I was talking about earlier about reducing or limiting saturated fat intake, but also emphasizing like a Mediterranean or plant-based dietary patterns, increasing omega-3 fatty acid consumption, focusing on anti-inflammatory foods. These really have shown to have benefits, especially in regards to the ACE gene and the research
Mhm.
done on that.
Yeah.
When we're talking about NOS3 gene, okay, we want to be able to increase and support nitric oxide production and bioavailability. So you want something, now you can't just, suck up nitric oxide or nitrous oxide or anything like that. It doesn't work like that.
Be fun
But
though.
what you want is nitrate rich foods, things like beets. And you'll notice that there are a lot of supplements,
Mm,
it's a beet extract that they
mhm,
use, as that active ingredient to help upregulate nitric oxide production. But also
mhm,
things like arugula, spinach,
mhm,
having antioxidant rich fruits and vegetables,
mhm,
having L-arginine, an amino acid, foods that have L-arginine, nuts, seeds, legumes.
mhm.
Also looking at polyphenol rich foods, things like berries and dark chocolate, which also has magnesium. And love my dark chocolate.
Food of the gods. Food of the gods.
And green tea.
Yeah.
Okay. So, these are definitely, other things that can help, along with like potassium, that helps to balance sodium effects. You mentioned garlic too, didn't you?
Yeah, I'm gonna offer, unless you're working
Yeah.
with a clinician,
Right.
potassium is not something I would play with because if you play with it, you
Definitely
can
not.
also play with your heart, and we don't want to be doing
Yes, you
that.
can.
So potassium is something you talk about with a doctor, but yeah, I think my favorite, I'll be plain, my favorite at least to start with is the sorrel. Um, sorrel. I learned I was pronouncing that wrong. In part just because I think it's such a delightful tea and there's such clinical evidence that it can lower blood pressure. But I think also we're really looking at magnesium to the end of that muscle relaxation. But separately, remember that magnesium is a cofactor of more than 300 enzymes in the body. Does it help with muscles? Yes. Is that important? Yes. But does it do 299 other things, probably 200 of which will influence blood pressure? Also, yes. So magnesium supplementation, I think, starting at around 200 to 400 milligrams per day, you can go up if you're talking with a doctor and working with a doctor, but that's shown to bring down blood pressure of consequence to some of that support that you're getting, right? And I think one last call out before we start to shift into questions and answers. For those that have a suboptimal presentation of ACE, here's kind of a cool value add that you might be getting. So this suboptimal presentation, if you're European, American, or African diaspora, the suboptimal presentation is either going to be AG or GG. And then if you're more sitting within those Southeast Asian diasporas, the optimal suboptimal presentation, again, AG, as well as AA. Okay. But if you have a suboptimal presentation there, um, omega-3 fatty acids have more of an impact on your immune system, on your cardiovascular system, and on your brain than do people with that optimal presentation. We don't fully understand the why behind that yet, but it has been found. So one of the value adds of having a suboptimal, at least when it comes to blood pressure presentation, one of the things that can be very supportive of your cardiovascular system and supporting its flexibility in support of reducing inflammation is going to have more impact on you. So if you're a suboptimal presentation of ACE, start sucking up that omega-3 in whatever fish or algae form you prefer it. Yeah.
Perfect.
Um, I think we're going to jump into questions and answers. Unless Dr. Varden, is there any other kind of supplement treatment that you want to toss out there? I know the
I,
temptation is going to be stress. We'll still
oh, I know.
defer that. Yeah, we'll
Yes,
still defer that
but
too. Yeah.
something that I wanted to mention was vitamin
Please.
C, because
See.
vitamin C can help to increase nitric oxide
Mm.
bioavailability. So, and it being a fantastic antioxidant and doing all the other wonderful things that it does,
Mm-hmm.
again, try to get this in your whole foods first.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Please.
Have that orange and grapefruit or, these different fruits. Don't forget they're in vegetables. Okay. They're in peppers and other things, amla berry, cherries, these are very high in that. And there are actually even some supplements that are based on whole food. They're not ascorbic acid, which is synthetic, which can still work and can work well. But I always like leaning into whole foods or whole food supplementation first. So I wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think vitamin C is very important. I think also just kind of the meta for everyone that's listening, and you wonder why doctors are beautifully now saying go work on your diet and lifestyle before, is that a whole foods plant forward diet gets you all of the happy little plant chemicals that naturally reduce blood pressure. There's a lot of chemicals we found that reduce blood pressure by way of ACE and a few other things, and that's because we would eat them and this would naturally happen to us, as well as we wouldn't be eating the other things. So it can, I think diet and lifestyle are probably the most powerful things to be taking away from here. And I appreciate they're not the easiest, but leverage your DNA 360 to understand your food and your craving sort of mentality, and that will really help with diet shifts too. Just a thought there. All right. Why don't we jump into questions and answers? For those members in the audience, the chat's been really quiet this evening, as have the questions. So I think we'll keep the questions open for another few minutes. And if you have any, make sure you toss them in so that we can make sure we're serving you best here this evening and speaking to what you want to know. So Janice is asking the question of, would a consistently high pulse rate, 80s to 90s, indicate a heart problem? Um, so a few answers to this, Janice. Again, it's kind of like blood pressure in the sense of, does a one-off high heart rate, is that an issue? Maybe, maybe not. It's the consistency. So I'd really encourage um, consistency there in monitoring it, right? And then additional to that, it also depends on how old you are and what's going on in your life that's really going to influence your pulse rate, as well as other things. So for example, if your blood pressure drops, right, you go from sitting to standing, your blood pressure is going to drop a little bit, your heart rate will naturally increase in response. So there's also going to be a question of what's going on. Will a consistently high heart rate be detrimental? To a certain extent? Absolutely, because you're overworking that heart muscle. You're kind of overworking. It's a sign the body isn't happy. So consistently, I would say yes. And if that's something you're concerned about, I'd really encourage you to be going to your doctor to get that evaluated, because that goes far beyond how we can support you in a webinar. But yeah, I hope that was helpful, Janice. All
I'll
right.
grab David's question. So David is asking, what would be the start of low blood pressure, 90/60? And actually, yes, that's generally considered the starting point, that threshold for low blood pressure hypotension. And I want to mention something though, because There is a time when lower blood pressure is not a problem, especially for some people like athletes, those
Yeah.
people with a slender build, maybe people who are genetically predisposed, sometimes individuals following a low carb or fasting protocols. So, I mean, it's normal to have blood pressure around or slightly below that with no symptoms. In fact, it can be a good sign of good cardiovascular fitness. But when it becomes a problem is when you have symptoms with it. Things like dizziness, lightheadedness, blurred vision, fatigue, weakness, nausea, um, fainting, things
Mhm.
like that. That's when, you know, you definitely want to have that checked out and, be aware of it. Is there anything else you think I
No,
missed?
I think that was brilliant. And I like that you captured, I think, in particular for athletes, for females who are menstruating, right? Your numbers are going to tend to be a lot lower compared to other people. And so there's always going to be this element of throughout the course of your life, different numbers will mean different things. And as you get older, right, we don't want your blood pressure high. We also don't want it too low because we don't want risk fainting. So like as you age, that number is going to change based on your life circumstances. So I hope that was helpful. All right, the next question I have here is, what is a good homocysteine level? And this is from Janice again. So for context of our audience, homocysteine is something you can take from the blood, and it's an amino acid, and it's really been used as a proxy marker or a surrogate marker for understanding cardiovascular risk, how well your body is methylating, and inflammation. Um, and so initially it was kind of said like if your homocysteine is super high, right, then we are concerned about cardiovascular risk of heart attack, risk of cardiovascular disease, right? That tightening and stiffening of the arteries. Okay, so it's considered normal in a conventional sense if you're under 15, right? Anything over 15 is where we start to get concerned with you're not methylating properly, increased risk. The ideal range, and I want to acknowledge that I'm talking ideal more from that functional perspective. If you go to a GP who's conventionally trained, they're going to be happy with under 15. When you come to our clinic, our goal is between 5 and 8. We don't want to go below 5. I know some people try to go as low as you can. This is not the limbo. We're not going as low as we can. We want to stick somewhere between 5 and 8, that being the optimal space that will reflect better cardiovascular outcomes by and large because of better methylation outcomes. So Janice, I hope that was helpful and perhaps even inspiring of other people to get some blood work that tracks their cardiovascular wellness. Yeah.
Right. So Allison is asking, what is the good version of NOS3? So this is the nitric oxide synthase gene that we look at. And the G version is the optimal version. The T version is suboptimal. So, if you have the GG, you're doing great. The bioavailability, vasodilation for nitric oxide production is good. If you have a GT or a TT, that's when you start getting into some reduced activity there, and support can definitely be helpful.
Good. All right. The next question we have is from Lisa, if I can see that far. Yeah, I need new glasses. So if ACE is GG, which would be suboptimal for Europeans, Africans, Americans, um, should we avoid salts like pink Himalayan salt or Redmond's real salt? I love this question. Thank you very much, Lisa, for raising this. So in the 70s, 80s, when blood pressure started to raise, right, one of the first very reactive, and it was well intended at the time, responses of medicine was absolutely cut your salt out, right? There's people like my mom who grew up with zero salt in the house because they were told it's going to destroy your blood pressure, it's going to destroy your heart. And I would say at the time it was what we thought was new, but also remember that in the 50s and 60s, what was there a rise of? There was a rise of processed and preserved foods. So there was an incredible increase of salt in our diet that did not come from your table salt shaker, right? It came from food choices at the time that we didn't per se know any better, okay? So is salt a problem? especially with a suboptimal gene presentation. It can be if you're consuming a lot of restaurant food, they make it tasty with the salt. If you're consuming a lot of preserved foods, right, then yes, salt is going to be a thing and you need to look at restricting it. But I would offer you have to actually just change your food types, right? As opposed to getting rid of those really good salts like the Himalayans or the Redmonds. And the reason is those salts come with trace minerals. You do get your salt, you get your sodium, your chloride, but you also get a lot of other trace minerals within those. And those trace minerals are categorically very, very, very important to cardiovascular wellness and body wellness. You need those small little minerals for a lot of different body functions, not to mention just your mitochondria, which is going to be powering everything. Okay. So the goal is, yes, salt reduction, but more in terms of less processed or less restaurant food, and not so much in terms of table salt, especially if you're getting in those really good diverse salts. So my thesis is more table salt, less processed food. All right, Dr. Varden.
Okay. Thank you. I love that. I'm so glad. That's always a question that comes up from clients. And I happen to have a poor ACE gene. I have a GG version. But I will be honest. I mean, of course, I also eat healthier and blood work and everything, but I put Celtic sea salt or Redmond's real salt in my water. And it's fine. And it's, knowing how it works for you. I'm glad that question came up and you answered it so beautifully. Thank you.
Oh, it's important.
So Diane is asking what type of magnesium and how much? And this is another question that I love because yes, there's a lot of different types of magnesium and what it is chelated to, what it is attached to can make a difference to where that magnesium goes to and how it can help with its particular function. Because remember, we said magnesium is a cofactor in over 300 enzymatic reactions in the body. So some of my favorites, magnesium threonate, that's THREONATE. This is best for brain health, memory, focus, cognitive support, because the molecular size is so small, it's the only form that's shown to cross the blood-brain barrier. So really good for things like brain fog, age-related decline, anxiety, neuroprotection, lots of different things like that. So, and I take it myself. I like taking it at night. Wonderful. So other magnesiums, magnesium glycinate, you will also see it as bisglycinate. That's much easier on the stomach, on the GI system. It's really good for sleep, relaxation. It binds with the glycine. That's what the glycinate comes from, which is a calming amino acid, which also helps to make it gentle on the stomach. Magnesium citrate. This is helpful for constipation, digestion. It can cause loose stools, especially in higher doses. So please don't use that as your main magnesium form. You will often find it in forms that come in multiple complexes. Okay, because there are some that have like magnesium malate, citrate, and bisglycinate. Okay, you'll often see that. Speaking of magnesium malate, this is best for energy production, muscle fatigue, people who might have fibromyalgia. Why? Because the malic acid supports ATP, which is your cellular energy, for that production. So very good for people with chronic fatigue, muscle weakness, things like that. Another one, now we're getting into heart health, magnesium taurate. This is really great to helping calm the nervous system and in heart health. Taurine supports heart rhythm, calming neurotransmitters. It's really ideal for blood pressure support, heart palpitations, anxiety, things like that. Another one that's good for heart is magnesium orotate, OROTATE. This is good for the heart muscle, cellular repair, because the orotic acid helps deliver magnesium to the cells and tissues. It's really good for athletes, cardiovascular health, tissue regeneration, things like that. And then, you'll also see things like magnesium chloride. Usually this is used like in topical, the magnesium oils, baths. It absorbs through the skin, is gentle on the digestion. Magnesium oxide, you'll see, which is often used, like in laxatives. And of course, Epsom salt baths, that is magnesium sulfate, great for soaking muscle relaxation, achiness, because your body will absorb that. So those really are the major ones. I get a lot of questions about magnesium in the different forms and what to take. So I hope that helped to clear that and give people more information about magnesium.
And I think you also spoke to Cinnamon effectively had a similar question. So Cinnamon, and I think Dr. Varden caught you there too. All right. Dave is asking a question. So Dave is saying, what about salt? Love it. He's been consuming about 5 grams of salt alongside magnesium, potassium, and other supplements. This has not affected blood pressure dropping. So I guess it hasn't resulted in a drop. And the goal is to get off some medicines. Dave, I would encourage you, I think at this point, if it sounds like you're trying to create your own um, supplement prescription that will support the reduction there, I'd really encourage you at this point in time to reach out to a clinician. I think supplements are really powerful and they have a really good place, but we want to make sure we're using them the appropriate amount, that they're not interacting with medications, and that if the goal truly is to bring blood pressure down, that's being monitored by a clinician so that you're not bringing it down too much by way of supplements as well as medication. And I think if you're doing very standard things and it's still not working, we really have to dig into the why, meaning, are there other things outside of supplements and medications that you're not that are not being considered and that should be brought into the plan? So I'd really encourage you at this point in time to work with a provider. If you want to work with us, don't hesitate to reach out. I'll offer up my boss lady's email if you want to get in touch with us for that. It's ceo@thednacompany.com. We'd love to be of service and support. I feel it would be a disservice for me to kind of pretend to know what was going on in your world and know how to adjust things. I think that has to come from a meeting and more exact, precise awareness of who you are and then what to be doing about that. All right. Dr. Varden, do you want to get Osed? Osed, you come often and I need to learn how to say your name. I'm going to work on that. And so shout out to you for coming often. Shout out to me for not knowing how to say anything.
Well, I'll tell you, I love this question that Osed asks because they're saying, by saturated fat, do you mean animal fat? As coconut oil is a different kind of saturated fat in MCT. Also, grass-fed organic butter is high in SCT, which is short chain fatty acids. So which saturated fat do you mean? And I love this. This is such an excellent point. And you're absolutely right to dig deeper here. So the term saturated fat, yeah, it gets thrown around a lot in health discussions, and it's not all the same. So I'm just going to break it down a little bit because I think this is so important when it comes to heart health, brain health, overall health, because to clarify, how different saturated fats can affect health. Again, especially with what we're talking about, cardiovascular health, and then also metabolism and inflammation. So very quickly, saturated fats, these are fats that have no double bonds between the carbon atoms. They are solid at room temperature. They're found both in animals, plant sources, but it's the chain length of the fat that makes a huge difference in how it behaves in the body. So your short chain fatty acids, these generally have 2 to 6 carbons. This would be like your butyric acid in grass-fed butter. This helps to support gut health, anti-inflammation, really good, very important. These short chain fatty acids are also what our gut microbes will break down from our foods and are very beneficial. Medium chain triglycerides, that's with the T, the MCT, that's what it stands for. These are 6 to 12 carbons. So this is like your coconut oil, MCT oil, some dairy fats. They often provide, some rapid energy. They get you into that ketogenic state. They're antimicrobial. Now, let's talk about long chain triglycerides. So this is like 14 carbons and longer. This is your animal fat, like beef tallow, lard, fatty cuts, palm oils. These are more likely to raise LDL cholesterol in some genotypes. Now, it's important to note that, and I would love to do a video really diving into all of these different fats a bit more, because it really is fascinating. But really what we're talking about when we say saturated fats, it's more so the long chain saturated fats, the animal fats, the processed meats, and especially realizing that the source, because not all meats are the same. You've got, your conventional cows that can get pumped with antibiotics or, be exposed to toxins, and toxins get stored in fat. Okay. So when we consume that, we are taking in those toxins as well, as compared to grass-fed and finished and happy cows and everything else. So even there is a little bit of a differentiation. So, but that's what I more mean when I was talking about fats that are generally referred to in guideline warnings against saturated fats in this case.
And I think I said you're kind of getting into just like we talked about the history of salt, I think the history of fat's also really important. Insofar as there's kind of been two big things that have happened, right? In that rise of processed foods, so was the rise not only of more saturated fats, but also trans fats, right? Meaning the fat had been processed a little bit and was configured in a way that was very inflammatory, plainly, and pained to the body. Okay. And of consequence to that, fat, especially in the 80s and 90s, got such a horrible rap. And we learned that taking it out of our diet impacts brain, impacts reproductive health, impacts everything. And so we're trying to now bring it back in, but we want to do that in a very intelligent way. And I think some of the most intelligence you can do is you bring fat into your diet, which is very good. Fat's important. But you also have to remember, from an evolutionary perspective, whenever we've had fat, we've also, except for certain maybe northern populations, anytime we've had fat, we've also had a lot of access to fiber and plants. So it tends to be the balance of the three, not necessarily just is it about the fat. It's about what that meal looks like in fullness. If you are northern, right, Northern European, Northern American, Northern, anything up there, there's a little bit of a nuance to that. But below that, right, that fat would always likely be part from an animal and would have always been coupled with other plant things. So keep that in mind as you're bringing back in some of the tasty, tasty fat. All right. Bradley has our next question. And they're saying that the C-reactive proteins are always high, 9 to 11. What is the best way to reduce this? So for context, C-reactive protein is something that doctors will use to look at generalized inflammation in the body. There's two ways that we look at this. One is CRP, or C-reactive protein, and that's very much a general inflammatory marker. We can sometimes get a little further refined and we look at a high sensitivity, or HSCRP, and that's a little more used within the cardiovascular space. So when those numbers start creeping up, right, that means in general there's a larger inflammatory burden in the body, and then we're seeing a correlated incidence of cardiovascular incident, that meaning like heart attack, stroke. And that's because we know those two sorts of things tend to go hand in hand, right? Is inflammation the sole and exclusive reason for heart attack and stroke? No, but it is a big part and it's one of the founding things. So tracking inflammation is really important. What's the best way to reduce this? Bradley, I may be giving you a question that you don't like the answer to, insofar as you really have to be working with a practitioner to figure out the best way. Saying your body is inflamed, um, there are many, many, many roads to inflammation. There's not just one way. Just like at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about with hypertension, it can be through blood volume in the kidneys and, sorry, the renin-angiotensin system. It can be through kidney damage, right? It can be through poor vasculature. It can be through stress. There's so many different ways to get to high blood pressure, and there are even more different ways to get to an inflammatory state. So it really takes a doctor evaluating what's going on. And I would also offer understanding genes too. Okay. Just to make sure that you're plainly getting ROI. I talk about lazy medicine often, right? Genes help me be a bit more lazy insofar as if I'm trying to solve a big problem, what do my genes say the biggest chunks that I can chip away at are? So I think all those things would be really helpful. So I hope that you start working with either your GP or maybe one of our practitioners to the end of figuring out what is causing that so that it can be brought down. All right. Dr. Varden, do you want to take Kevin's question?
Sure. Okay, so Kevin was asking any comment on arterosil to strengthen endothelial cells and another product, Cardio Miracle, for the NOS3. And, he's mentioning the particular variants that he happens to have for his 9P21 and for the NOS3. And these are specific supplements that are out there. They are things that I have recommended in the past. There are several different types of supplements that can be offered, and I wouldn't say that as far as like, oh yes, you should take this, because I don't like to offer or say that someone should take something without knowing what more of their history is, looking at the larger picture. But in general, arterosil, their claims and information that they have, does show that, for example, arterosil, that it directly addresses the 9P21 related, vasculature by helping to rebuild that protective layer, that gel layer, mucosal layer of the vascular lining. And that can help to improve arterial elasticity, to reduce LDL adhesion to the vessel walls. So yeah, they do have some research on that. I haven't dove in a lot to some of the others, but this is where I would definitely recommend working with a practitioner, to say, are these good for you? But to say just based on that one gene alone, I don't think would be prudent to do. So, but there's a lot of things out there that can be very helpful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I think artichoke, that it's a seaweed extract and it's quite, I'll offer it's quite magical what it does. And it's not something you ever feel the benefit of per se. It's tricky that some of the preventative stuff you don't feel, but it's a neat
Right.
one. Osad has another question. Using a number of supplements from the DNA company, uh, some say, depending on the supplement, it will give a specific range of capsules, but does not say with or without food, how to take those. So I would offer, yeah, do follow label instructions unless you've talked with a provider who says differently, right? And by and large, um, depends on the supplement. I think if it's a B, if it's the methyl you probably want to take that with food because B vitamins can upset an empty tummy. The balance, I believe, can be taken either with or without food, especially for some of the deep calm ones or the BDNF. You'll feel a bit more of an impact if it's on an empty stomach, right? Um, but it's entirely up to you and just kind of how your tummy feels and responds to things going into it when it's empty. And I think this advice can be given across the board based on different supplements. Herbs are a little bit of a different category. Some are better on empty stomach, some are better with food, but with supplements, typically it's going to be with food unless otherwise detailed. All right. Diana, right? Yes, Diana has our last question of the evening. She's asking if there's any information that we can send in the follow-up to this. Diana, there won't be a anything written coming out after this. We will make this available though through our YouTube channel if you want to watch it again. And separate to that, just keep your eye on your inbox, your email box, for any other webinars that we're doing, right? We really try to ensure that we're covering the full 360 of health. I'm very punny there. Because to the end, it all impacts that wellness goal. And so we'll be doing things on cardiovascular health again, if that's of interest to you. And we do things on mental health, on hormones, on diet, nutrition, on weight, on all the fun things. And so if you're interested in any of that, just keep your eye to your inbox or check out our YouTube channel where you can see these replays. All right, Dr. Varden, I think that might be it for a topic that 1 and 2 struggle with, at least in the US. We're seeing a little bit more crickets on it, which perhaps means that people are a bit more educated on it and have a better grasp as to what to do. Whether they're doing it is a different question, but they at least have a better grasp on what it is to do. Yeah.
Yeah. And it always comes back to the diet, lifestyle, your state, less stress.
Mm,
Overall,
mhm,
love your body, love your heart, take care of
mhm.
yourself, give yourself
Yeah.
some grace and
Mm.
breathe.
Yeah, yeah. I
So,
think I think that's really important. And the breath for those that are interested, do check out our YouTube channel to see ones we've done on breath work and one we've done on stress. Because again, the mood and behavior behind all of this, the brain side of this is huge. And we didn't focus on it in this one, but it's really important to understand it's there and to well round yourself with that information as well. All right, Madame, I think it is time that the proverbial fat lady sings and we bounce out.
all right. Thank you again
All
so
right.
much for such a wonderful webinar. Thank you to our audience for joining us and for sticking around and learning more about your health. And we are so excited to see you for our next webinar.
Mhm.
Take care, everyone.
Au revoir, mes amis. Au revoir. We'll dance out.